G'day crypto goers, I'm Adam Stokes. Welcome back to the channel where we have an exciting guest on tonight. Martin North is the creator and host of the Digital Finance Analytics channel, where he primarily offers independent insight into the Australian and New Zealand finance and property markets. He provides intelligent and data-driven information and analysis to savers and investors alike, as well as providing up-to-date commentary on the latest money, economics, and property news. He has more than 31,000 subs on YouTube and regularly engages with leading economists, entrepreneurs, and finance commentators. Martin, thanks for joining us tonight.
Hi, Adam. Good to be here. Thanks for the offer.
Martin, I hope to discuss with you the cash ban, negative interest rates, bail-in laws, and how these all merge with the worlds of crypto. But tonight, before we get into that, I really want to learn a little bit about the man that is Martin North. Can you tell us how you got into YouTube?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I've been looking at finance and property for a long, long time. I ran a consulting business for a good number of years and worked in various other contexts. But about 8 years ago, I set Digital Finance Analytics up as my own business. And I started then running a blog and then decided maybe I should just try YouTube, and I made a few YouTube videos and didn't really take it very seriously. And about 2 years ago, I thought, do you know, I'm really interested in this YouTube stuff. I think what I'll try is I'll try doing regular posts on the sort of stuff that I do on the DFA blog, right? And as soon as I started going regular, and as soon as I started, frankly, being much more no holds barred in terms of the conversations and my thoughts, I started realizing that there was actually an interesting audience out there who were very interested in my perspectives. And so we started 2 years ago doing daily YouTube blogs. And that's how it's all started, gone from there. So I now go via Twitter as well, and LinkedIn and my blog. But the YouTube channel has really taken over as the primary distribution channel now for what I do. And so essentially you'll often find that I do a blog, I'll write something for the YouTube channel, for the DFA channel as well, and then do a podcast too, but all around the same things. So that's pretty much it. And now I've invested a little bit of time and effort into getting the system working a little better, and got green screens and lights and those things. And also it's much easier now than previously because I've got a bit of technology automation in the mix too, so I can sort of push a button and get things happening. So but it's all about that. I'm quite interested in technology, but really it's about trying to communicate more broadly about these very important issues that we are faced with at the moment.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed watching your channel grow, and I've watched also, as I mentioned just before we got into this, I've enjoyed watching your technological advancements grow. And I think many YouTubers go through this journey that we start off with, in some instances, just a mobile phone. Then we learn about sound and lighting and green screen. But I think you've also nailed a niche market, and that niche market is a lot of what we're not discussing in the mainstream media. So in my world, I don't really watch TV anymore. I don't watch TV anymore because I find there's a lot of bias in there. And I wouldn't mind if there was bias if it was balanced both ways. Like even if they said, today we're going to talk about the left and we're going to talk about the right. And if they presented both sides, I'd be quite happy with that. And I think what you're doing and other people similar to what you're doing in this space is you're creating the other side. You're showing the other side and you're creating a balance in what's presented, which basically leads us into what we're going to talk about tonight. And that is the cash ban. Now, I've released a 4-part series on the cash ban and many parts of what is happening to the Australian economy and in many ways the global economy, and how the cash ban fits into not just one bill in itself, but negative interest rates, bail-in laws, inflation, fiat currencies. Now, my background in on YouTube is mainly crypto, but there are 3 reasons why people get into crypto, and I'd seek your thoughts on everything that I just went over there with the cash ban, negative interest rates and bail-in laws. But the 3 reasons people get into crypto is primarily to buy a Lambo. That is, they buy low and they sell high, and then they're going to make a lot of money. The other reason is the love of technology. And then the third reason, and this is where our worlds collide, if you will, is to break away from the banks and the broken fiat system, and to really bring to light what is wrong with fiat and what is wrong with some of these monetary policies that the world is facing and Australia is seeing, with the endless quantitative easing of pumping money into an economy, reducing these interest rates into nothing. So how do all these things tie up into crypto, do you think, from where you are, as if I may say, perhaps in the traditional finance space, looking at property and finance and the economics? How do you see this wraps into the crypto space?
Well, let's take it from the crypto, out as it were, right? Because I've been following the crypto evolution for quite some little time, and I've always been quite intrigued by the fact that there's frankly nothing underpinning crypto other than people's faith in crypto, right? Because there is no central control. It's devolved. There is no underlying value. It's all about where the future price is going to be. And actually, there are strong parallels, therefore, between crypto and some of the other philosophies around money. Because, frankly, if you look at money today, there's nothing supporting it other than the faith that somebody will actually, give you value for the note that you had. So we've moved off the gold standard many years ago, and we've inflated the value of money to billio for all sorts of reasons, partly political, partly economic, and partly, I think, without meaning to. So we have a financial framework which is in the mainstream world wobbly, to put it mildly. You've got crypto, and there are people, I think, who really believe that the next evolution of money is going to be digital, and it's going to be decentralized. And it probably will be based around blockchain in some way. Now, I think they're right in terms of blockchain, because I think the blockchain philosophy, which is, the multi-ledgers and all those things, and the devolved control of information, is absolutely right. We'll see that run through. It will be also digital in terms of, there'll be, bits and bytes, and that's all. But the third question is it decentralized or is it not? And that's where I get into some interesting philosophies. Because if you listen carefully to central banks, they've started talking now about a central bank digital currency. So what they're wanting to do is effectively spill over what they've been doing into the digital environment. In fact, there was a very interesting Mark Carney, who's the guy in charge of the Bank of England, made a very interesting speech when he was over in the US earlier in the year at a big conference of central bankers. And he said that his view is that ultimately it's quite likely that the dollar, which today is, if you like, the global backstop currency, will at some point be replaced. Could be replaced by another currency like the yuan, or he says it could actually be replaced by a digital currency. And that digital currency would have some of the characteristics of cryptos, but they would also have characteristics more in line with those currencies that are controlled by central banks. And he specifically mentioned Libra, of course, which is the Facebook-driven thing, right? So there's a really interesting tussle going on in terms of, will the future of crypto be completely devolved, decentralized, no control, a Bitcoin Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV? Or will it ultimately corral and be caressed and sort of cohere around something more to do with central banks and central banks controlling again? Because the nexus point is, what is the role of a central bank, right? What is it trying to do? And how is all the interfering that's been done in the last 20 years in particular, and particularly in the last 10 years since the GFC, really helped? Because my view is the central banks have completely lost their way. They actually are believing now that they almost can play God, so they can keep creating money and they can do QE and all those things and take interest rates very low and everything will be fine. They have not solved the issues that were created around the global financial crisis. They've tried to stop the financial system collapsing, but in doing so, they've devalued money, they've created quantitative easing and all those things. And that uncertainty that's been created by those strategies have, if you like, opened the door to crypto and, given people the chance then to think about alternatives. But I have a feeling that we haven't heard the last of central banks' digital currencies, and I suspect that crypto will ultimately evolve in that direction.
I have wondered if central banks are controlling the governments or the governments are controlling the central banks. Now, yeah, on paper, it should be governments who have control over their economies. Then you get into Keynesian economics, and we look at the value of real money. That is, whatever money has been derived from, whether that be gold in the ground or human labor that has created a value in this currency. I argue that we're already in the digital age. So the godfather in my space is Andreas Antonopoulos, and we speak about digital money already being in. But the difference between digital fiat and digital crypto is that one is centralized and one is decentralized. Now, of course, when we get to Bitcoin, no one actually owns Bitcoin. There is no company. There is no one to say, I lost my password and try and get your money back if you lose a Bitcoin, as example. But I agree with what you're saying, is that when we get into the crypto space, I think governments, noting we are already using digital money, I think governments will use a more efficient way of dispersing money or moving money around through the blockchain. Now, we've seen this in other revolutions through government, where we used to move information around via snail mail, and then the internet came out and we started moving information around via the internet. And now we have the same thing happening with money. And instead of using SWIFT as an example and other financial systems to move money around the world, we now have the blockchain and an option. We have an option to have a decentralized blockchain, such as Bitcoin, or a centralized blockchain, such as whatever government chooses to make, or something, as an example, like XRP or other cryptos out there. But in any case, I'm concerned about what's happening with the bail-in laws and the negative interest rates. Now, we can see governments have multiple levers to control the money supply, the tax rates, the interest rates, quantitative easing, and all these levers are in there to essentially try and stimulate an economy, slow it down, speed it up, or control it. But when those levers are taken away, we open the economy to the free market. And more importantly, we take power away from centralized bodies. So do you feel, from what you've seen in this space, that the cash ban is a deliberate move by the government or the banks, and I'm not sure which one it is, to maintain this control and maintain wealth? Or do you think they're actually doing it for the good of the people to try and keep economies propped up forever?
Right. Well, so, there are two schools of thought here. There are those who are thinking they're all isolated, cash ban, bail-in, all the other stuff is all isolated, right? And there's no, if you like, overall coordination, right? I have to say I don't find that very credible. And the reason for that I say that is, if you look at the IMF, for example, they wrote a paper quite recently that said, as interest rates get lower towards zero, people ultimately will not receive any interest on their deposits. As soon as they receive no interest on their deposits, they will pull money out of the banking system. The only way to allow quantitative easing to continue to work into negative rate territory is to make it harder for people to take cash out of the system, right? And therefore, I see a cash ban predominantly connected with the negative interest rates. Why are negative interest rates being brought in? Because, as I said earlier on, they're still trying to fix the problem from a decade ago. And frankly, we've not learnt anything, right? So we know from Japan, we know from Europe, that low interest rates and quantitative easing doesn't solve anything. It just distorts the economy even more. There are places now in Europe where they charge you to hold deposits at the bank. That's nuts, right? And they basically have very, very low interest rates on loans. And in some cases, in Scandinavia, they almost pay you to take a mortgage. This is nuts. So that's the sort of the first point. Second point is, because of the financial system, and because we've actually inflated the financial system and departed from gold as a standard and all those things, and we've allowed debt to get bigger and bigger and bigger, we're in the situation now where essentially the size of the banking system is only determined by who you can lend money to. The more money you can lend, the bigger you can make the banking system. So this whole idea that we had some time ago that the size of the money supply and the amount of money in the system was limited to the deposits that were there or to gold, completely gone, right? So basically, the modern theory of banking is if you can find somebody to lend money to, then you can create an electronic entry, you can create cash, fiat, let it be. And that cash will then be able to do something. It could create deposits, or it could create, you could go buy a house or whatever. And it's that money creation process which is really behind the scene here. So we've seen this massive money creation process. In the process, everything is devalued, right? But as you approach zero, as you get to these negative interest rates, there are a few things that happen. Firstly, deposits are meaningless, useless. Look at Japan. The biggest item that's for sale in Japan now is home safes, because people have taken notes out of the system and just put it in a safe, because at least in a safe you know it's there and you're not losing any money. You're not gaining anything, but you're not losing it.
It can't escape inflation, though, can it?
Well, that's the point, of course, and that is the critical issue, right? So effectively, you hold cash, but if inflation's running at 3%, then every year you're losing 3%. But it's better than the alternative, which is it all completely dissipates. Now, the other side of it is we know that the banking system is under pressure, and we know that thanks to the derivatives, thanks to the overlending that's been done, many banks are in difficulty. And so the bail-in is another strategy that people are now talking about. So if you go back a decade, we had lots of bank failures around the world. Those banks were rescued by governments effectively putting money into the banking system, right? And that cost the taxpayer trillions of dollars around the world. And some banks are still publicly owned. For example, in the UK, Royal Bank of Scotland is still partly owned by the government in the UK. Now, after that, the powers that be, the IMF and the World Bank and those august bodies, the Bank for International Settlements, all got around the table and said, we can't do that again. We need to find an alternative path. So some bright spark, some banker came up with the idea of saying, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we allow for the situation, if a bank gets into difficulty, they should have a plan, and that plan should firstly be a living will, so you try and keep the bank running. But if that doesn't work, you can then convert deposits into shares in the bank. And so depositors become shareholders, right? And suddenly that bank looks secure again and can continue, so it stops it failing, right? If a bank doesn't fail, then government doesn't have to bail out the bank. And that's what bail-in is. So bail-in is essentially a way of trying to stop central bailouts by governments by giving effectively shares to existing depositors. Or think of it another way, what they've said is when you make a deposit to a bank, you're lending money to that bank. So you're at risk, you're an unsecured creditor of the bank. And what they're doing is effectively saying, well, we can't repay your deposit, but what we'll do is give you shares. Now, you don't have an idea what the value of those shares will be. And that's what the bail-in thing is, right? Now, again, it goes back to the trying to protect the existing banking system, right? And in New Zealand, there's a very good example of this, where effectively through what's called the open banking resolution, it's all very clear. You can go and look it up on the website. The Reserve Bank in New Zealand simply says, if a bank gets into difficulty and we've got no other choice, we'll bail in. Now, it's not so clear in Australia. There was a bill passed a couple of years ago through the back door, so we know that exists. I think that bail-in and the cash ban and all those other things that we've been talking about is all part of this idea of trying to keep people into the banking system, right? And it's part of the digital world that we're going to, so effectively digital ID. In fact, Phil Lowe said this a couple of days ago, he's a very strong advocate for a digital ID that everybody should have, right? So cash ban, digital ID, bail-in, it's all the same stuff, right? It's trying to control and contain the way that people run their finances. And that's what I'm worried about. But we're giving up freedoms we don't understand we've given up. We are effectively sleepwalking into a future which is much more controlled, much less free than currently. And, if you can't now transact above $10,000 if the cash ban comes in, today you can. That's a freedom taken away, right? It'll never be, recovered. And whilst people say, well, hardly anybody does that. No, but you should have the freedom to do it, because today you have that liberty. So civil liberties are at risk. Control at the centre is what we're seeing. And it's all about trying to stop this economy and other economies around the world tanking. But the reason that they probably won't be successful is that we're still dealing with the GFC a decade ago. We haven't solved anything. We haven't learned anything. And unfortunately, going back to your earlier question, well, is it the government or is it the banks? Understand that the central banks get together through the Bank for International Settlements, right? And Philip Lowe, for example, leads one of the big committees over at Basel. Mark Carney, who's the Bank of England guy, involved with the Bank for International Settlements. So there is this international group of bankers who basically are calling the shots, and essentially then it comes back, and then the local instances implemented in the local economies. So freedom, well, who owns it? Not sure, but I can tell you that the centralised thinking around the banks, whether it's groupthink or whether it's a plan, big debate. I'm not going to open that at the moment, but nevertheless, the impact is that we are losing freedoms, things are being imposed on us, and we are sleepwalking into a future that I'm quite concerned about.
I wish I could disagree with you, Martin, but what's quite alarming to me is everything that you've surmised just there is what many people are thinking, and myself included. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I've done a 4-part series on the cash ban, and I unfortunately agree with you entirely. And it's greatly concerning to me as an Australian, someone who's lived all around the world, and watching this great country, as you said it well, we're sleepwalking into this loss of freedom. And this number that you speak of, this ID, it's linking, or it looks similar to what we're doing or what we're seeing in China with the social score. And of course, when a bank can see everything that you buy, and some of the examples I give is if I buy a Bible or a Quran, well, depending on the government at the time, that could work against my social score. And as we also see in other countries, if you buy a bottle of wine or too much wine, that can work against your social score. Now, maybe we shouldn't buy too much wine, maybe we should, but at the end of the day, wine is not illegal. And if I want to buy a bottle of wine and make sure that it's not on my credit card statement, that should be my civil liberty. And I see the freedom of democracy is not just the freedom of speech, it's the freedom of commerce, the freedom of association, the freedom of expression, and most importantly, the freedom of privacy. And if we look at I use this example of freedom. If we look at the freedom of privacy for someone who's in prison, well, many of your privacy rights are taken away from you. You're in a cage where everyone can see you. You're going to the toilet in front of everyone. And that might seem an extreme example, but it's not, because it's on the spectrum of freedom. And when you're in a cage, and whether it's figurative or literal, people can see what you're doing. Now, at the other end of freedom and privacy, you can see those who have a lot of wealth. I remember when I lived in Malibu, many of the properties had walls around it, or you would be in gated communities. And that was a symbol or a sign of privacy and freedom. Now, if you want to be private, that's great. But the video I released recently, and I seek your opinion on this 8 phases that I actually put out on this video. I basically broke it down, and I really did a lot of in-depth thinking, and having covered money for some time now myself, these were the 8 phases that I see of this whole thing. And I agree with you entirely that the Bailin law and the cash ban, it all intertwines. Phase 1 was the removal of the gold standard. By removing the gold standard, money had no value per se. It was just us all agreeing, or the government saying, this is money, fiat, it is so, let it be, and therefore the gold standard was gone. Phase 2 was fractional reserve lending, where centralized non-elected bodies could create money out of thin air by holding a fraction of a reserve and lending out a lot more than they ever had. Phase 3 was bailout laws, as you described, when banks could do whatever they want, all the while knowing that no matter how bad it went, our taxes would bail them out of trouble. And then, as you described, when the governments realized, well, hang on, instead of using our reserves, how about we use the people's reserves, which was phase 4, which is bail-in laws. And the bail-in laws is as I'm sure you agree, is exactly the same as the bailout laws. The only difference is instead of using our tax dollars, we're now using our savings, and you're forced to buy these shares in a company that is failing and operating in market failure. And on a side note, I think about, imagine running a business where you can do whatever you want in your business, and no matter how poorly it goes, the government will fix you up. And then go the other way, no matter how poorly it goes, you can just go to your customers and say, oh, you know, that kitchen I installed for you, well, I've destroyed everything, but that's all right. You have to pay me to have another crack at it, or pay me to not even have another crack at it, just pay me because I ruined the whole project. But phase 5 after the bail-in laws is negative interest rates. Now, I argue that we're already at negative interest rates, because if you look at a standard savings deposit of, I don't know, 0.5%, it's ridiculous at the moment. Let's say for argument's sake, it's 1%, and inflation is 2%, and these numbers are very fluid. But ultimately, if you put money in the bank, you're already at negative interest rates, because no matter what you do with your money, it is in this bubble of invisible tax where it is slowly eroding. Even if you think you have a term deposit, unless it's above really 3 or 4%, you're just losing money. And even if it is at neutral percent, well, then you're subjected to the bail-in laws, which goes to phase 6, Martin, of the cash ban. Because if you say, you know what, I don't want anything to do with this, I'm out of here, I want to be, for example, in Japan, I want to put money in a safe. Well, if they ban cash, you can't put the money in the safe. So you have to keep it in these broken systems that are dealing with negative interest rates and bail-in laws. Phase 7 of this move, and this is where it gets a little bit scary for me, is banks controlling governments. Now, I asked about, you know, who's in charge? Is it banks or governments? And this is where I got a lot of passion on my channel about the Royal Commission. So in one of my videos when I was speaking about the cash ban, many comments came in about the Royal Commission. Even though I didn't specifically speak to that topic, the good Australian people are waking up to the fact that this is all intertwined, which unfortunately leads to phase 8, which I'm sad to hear you say without me even prompting you to say. It was basically the attacks on democracy and freedom. And in my opinion, phase 8 is the collapse of democracy and freedom. So going over those quickly again, phase 1, the gold standard, phase 2, fractional reserve lending, phase 3, bailout laws, phase 4, bail-in laws, phase 5, negative interest rates, 6, cash ban, 7, banks controlling governments, phase 8, the collapse of democracy and freedoms, all the while this thing under the umbrella or within the bubble of inflation. In your opinion, do you think that's a pretty accurate summary of what's happening, or am I missing a step or putting too many in?
Well, I think you're hitting all the right notes. What I would say, though, is that it isn't necessarily sequential like you're arguing, right? So let me give you 3 examples of where freedoms have been taken away, right? We now have positive credit in Australia, right? We used to have negative credit. In other words, only if you defaulted on the loan would you be on a register somewhere. But now, 18 months ago, that all switched around. We're now actually positive. So everybody has a credit score, right? Most people don't realize they've got a credit score, but every time you don't pay a bill or you're late with a bill, if it's a mobile phone or whether it's a loan, that information is now collected, right? Did we vote for that? I didn't, but I suspect that that's an example of freedom lost, right? Another item of freedom lost with the cash ban, we had 3,500 people object to the cash ban when the Treasury put it out late on a Friday, quietly, very short period of time, 3,500. But they denied pretty much air to most of those objections, saying that they were an orchestrated campaign, right? Then Senate had another inquiry, and basically they've asked for submission, another 2,600, but many of those were not posted. Again, somebody up in Canberra decided it wasn't important. And now just the latest, right? There is a hearing tomorrow of the Senate inquiry on the cash ban. When did the announcement of that come out? It came out tonight.
It came out after 5 o'clock.
5:31 tonight. So the day, 11th of December for 9 a.m. tomorrow in Canberra. So it's an open meeting, right? So they deliberately did this to stop, essentially, people being able to go and be part of it. So, we're losing democracy. Another example, all of the issues to do with security and, terrorism and all those things. It's all a big excuse, right? All of this about freedom and democracy, right, and protecting, it is an excuse, and it's an excuse to take away from us, the normal people of Australia, our rights and privileges. And my frustration is that it's taken, a couple of hundred years to get a lot of those freedoms earned, and yet we're just giving them up one by one by one. And so that's my point about, end game is probably less democracy than ever, and more centralised control, less power at the states, more at the federal level. All of that stuff digitally enabled, right? I can see all the components, and whether that's a deliberate plan or whether it's simply a logical endpoint based on all the things that are going on, I'm not sure I know that. But I'm very, very concerned about the freedoms lost, and the fact that if I think of a generation or two ahead who won't remember what freedoms were like, you've got to take a long-term view here. You could end up in a society that frankly is already quite closed relative to many others around the world even now, that economically is going to be very controlled. And, there are people who actually want this to happen. I'm somebody who doesn't want it to happen, and I think we should be resisting and calling it out. One of the reasons why the DFA channel's there, because, people need to actually understand that this is real and it's happening. And if we do nothing, that's where we end up. So I agree that your journey is pretty much mapped out correctly.
Yeah, it's when I was actually writing down the order, it was I could see at each sort of phase. You're right. These freedoms were being eroding, but it all leads to somewhere, and that end state is ultimately democracy and freedoms lost. And when I was speaking to Robbie from the CEC in an interview recently, who actually put me in touch with you. Well, I reached out to see if I could touch base with you, and I do very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. One of the things that I was speaking to Robbie about was all these worlds are actually merging now. That is, your channel is not necessarily about crypto, but mine originally was. And by way of background, one of my degrees is economics, and I don't say that as a good thing. I say that as I'm actually quite embarrassed. And the reason why I'm embarrassed about that is because I should have known better, but it wasn't until I got into Bitcoin and crypto and understanding the blockchain and decentralization of money and fiat systems, it wasn't until then I really understood everything that we're discussing tonight. Now, I use my degree, one of my degrees, as an example in economics, because here I am, another degree I have, or as a Master's of Business and Management, and all of these worlds should have shown me what money is about. Now, that made me start to realize that if I've spent all those years at university studying this space, and it wasn't until I got into Bitcoin that I actually started to really understand it, then what does that say for the rest of the people who don't do economics degrees or Masters of Business and all these other degrees? What are these ones who perhaps don't go to university or are into arts, or I don't know, even STEM to a certain extent? I'm greatly concerned that many people don't understand anything about money. But glass half full, Martin, what's happening with the younger generation, if you will, and even the older generation, some of my subs are somewhat older, they're moving into crypto to break away from this. Now, of course, governments will eventually come after crypto, and the kind of good thing about Australia is comparative to America, they haven't been so hard on crypto as the American government has. So America's really cracked down on it. And my accountant, I did an interview with a chartered accountant about Bitcoin and crypto in Australia. And what he said was something quite powerful to me. He said, the reason why Australia allows it at the moment, possibly, this is just a hypothesis, is because it's something that they can tax. Now, I certainly know from my last tax return, boy, did I pay tax on crypto. I paid big money on tax on crypto, but as a result, the government got a good tap into money. But I'm worried that once people exit out of the fiat system entirely and move into the crypto space, there's going to be more foul play, just as you described tonight, with an open meeting in Parliament tomorrow where anyone can attend, and yet at 5:30 at night, with no business hours before to plan it. So imagine the average person around Australia, or even if you live in Canberra, how are you going to call your boss tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning and say, hey, boss, I'm not coming into work today at zero notice. because Parliament released a notice saying that, hey, tomorrow, without any warning to you, I can go and attend this meeting to have my say on the future of Australia's money. Are we going to see more foul plays in this space?
Well, we are, and you might be interested to know that in the cash ban, there is in the bill, there is the bill and there is the regulation. The regulation is something which can be changed just by a minister's pen stroke, right? And one of the things that can be changed is to include cryptocurrencies in the cash ban. It's not in there yet. It's excluded at the moment because of the fact that it's in the regulation excluded. But basically, they said once it gets to scale, it's likely to be included. So the card's marked already, right?
I enjoyed one of your videos where you spoke about public servants in the olden days. I thought it was really powerful, mate, and I think you did well. I think you summed it up really well. You basically said, and I'm sorry if I'm paraphrasing poorly here, but your video was about public servants of past used to create or design or explore these policies, and the minister would sign off on it. Now this has been completely turned on its head. What happens is a minister will just stroke of a pen at 5:30 at night saying, yeah, we're kind of doing this and we'll kind of give you an opportunity to talk. And then the good public servants of Australia have to react to that bill, have to react to that legislation or react to that policy.
Yep.
So now long gone are the days where good Australians, as part of a democratic system and working for the Commonwealth of Australia and the federal government and even state governments, could design good policies for a minister to consider and then discuss and then implement. Now it's just this person says this at the 12th hour, public servants just react.
Yeah, well, that's right. And remember that many politicians have no experience of the areas that they're actually looking after, right? So you might get a treasurer, for example, who really has very little understanding of economics and the way that the system works, and yet could be calling the shots, as you say, stroke of a pen type thing, right? And you can see that again and again and again. So the whole idea of fearless and frank advice from people who really understand the issues, which is what the civil service used to be, is just going out the window, right? Essentially, more and more decisions now are being boiled back and taken by the people who we elected, but frankly, I'm not sure we should necessarily trust them to look after our interests. They're looking after their interests. They're thinking about the self-perpetuation of their particular party and their particular points of view. And in the process, again, we're losing freedoms left, right, and centre. They're just falling off the back of the lorry. And that's really, really concerning in my view.
Yeah, I tried not to touch too much on politics, but I lived in the States for a year. I went to uni over there, and I used to think that America in many ways was very much like Australia, but just a few years in the future. And although we shouldn't touch too much on Trump because it can stimulate a lot of emotion, my thoughts are, as you mentioned, and you've nailed it. You basically said a lot of these politicians or ministers who are in charge don't actually have the experience to do what they're doing. And that's why I actually have no issue with millionaires or billionaires or successful business people being at the top of a government. And the reason why I have no issue with that is, first of all, they're elected to that. So they've gone through a democratic process to get to that position, which is great. But the main reason why I want them there is because if I am going to have someone manage my economy, I want someone who's got a proven track record of at least managing a business, at least managing their own life, at least managing many people and a micro economy. What I don't want is someone who's never, ever done that, who's never actually experienced failure. I want to have a leader who's experienced failure so they can learn from their mistakes. And I'm wondering if Australia may follow suit and find a leader who has business experience, who understands people, who puts trust in their advisors, but has a vision for their country. Do you think, as we aim to wrap this up shortly, Martin, do you think we're going to see a revolution in Australian politics?
Well, we need a revolution in Australian politics. My concern is that there are people with lots and lots of money out there who will try and buy their way into the top. And that is the worst possible outcome, right? Because money talks. And if you look at the US, good example, to become president, you have to have huge budgets.
Yeah.
That's a major concern. But I do think we need the vision thing, right? We need a clearer view of what Australia is going to be when it grows up, and what are the core values that actually will determine what we are. I think there are things about freedom and democracy and all those things which are really, really important. We also need people to articulate this from an economic standpoint, from a climate change standpoint, because I think climate change is really, really important in the overall scheme of things here. You can't just ignore it. And basically, we've got to stop being tactical and negative and responsive to what's been in the past, and begin to lay a vision for the future. So that is what I keep coming back to. We need the vision thing. We need people leading us who actually can see beyond the end of their nose and beyond to the next political win, and take a more strategic view of our nation. Because if we don't do that, it's going to be a terrible future.
The ultimate downfall, I believe, in our political system is comparative to America. So I like to compare and contrast many democracies around the world, and I think what Australia does very poorly in our political design is leaders can't lead, and the reason why they can't lead is because they can be fired from within. Need proof? Look at the last 7 prime ministers within our country. So you have this push-pull effect, or this double puppetry effect, as I like to call it. So you have the people, which are the puppet strings at the top, and then you have the cabinet, which is the puppet with the hand up the puppet, so to speak. So you've got this double puppet effect, and ultimately you cannot lead that way. You cannot make any decisions. And again, you need proof. Look at the last 7 prime ministers. These people have been wiped out of their positions overnight with no say from you and me. And this is where I actually think the American system is better. I think the American system, in my opinion, is better in the sense that you elect a president and that's it. That person is in charge in the position, pending impeachments, of course, which they're throwing left, right, and centre at him. But those aside, which is a process that they can use, fair enough. But ultimately, it enables a leader to lead. And the worst case I think I saw in Australia was when the super tax came in almost overnight. The individual the Prime Minister who went to put in the super tax, which is basically putting a bigger tax on big corporations to get more money from the coal and iron ore or whatever that we pull out of the ground. He lost his job. He lost his job overnight. And that was hugely alarming to me as an Australian. I think what would have been a better system, or should be a better system, is someone that can lead on values-based. And I agree with you entirely. We need good leadership, but I actually don't think this country is in a position where we allow good leadership. Because when you've got this double puppetry system, it's impossible to lead. Just imagine on a micro scale, imagine you're a manager at your job and you've got to appease your boss, but at any time your employees can fire you. Well, how can you really have any vision and any path forward? But anyway, that's just my 2 cents on that. To close off, Martin, again, I'm very grateful that you joined me tonight, and I'd like to talk to you more. I could speak to you all night, actually. Just with tomorrow, that being the discussion in Parliament, what are your recommendations to the Australian people, noting that they've left this to the 12th hour?
Well, it's still not too late to pick up the phone and make a fuss to your Member of Parliament and basically say the cash ban is too far, because essentially you're taking away rights and freedoms that I have today. You're doing this for a series of reasons that are not clear and are not transparent, and you are not actually following due process. Those are the sorts of things we need to be saying. And I think the more people who pick up the phone and just make sure that their MPs know that we know what they're up to, because there's still a chance, I think, to derail the cash ban, but time is quite short. They reported back in February, and remember that the bill has already passed the lower house, so basically it's the Senate that's the critical leverage point in terms of actually dealing with it. So, but it's
how much time have we got left?
Well, we've got a few weeks, because essentially everything sort of dies down until February, unless they were to resurrect it beforehand. But I think they probably will do it sometime, in February. So we've got a few weeks. But it's worth lobbying. It's definitely worth picking up the phone, calling your senators, calling your MPs. The more people who actually make a fuss, the more chances we can stop it.
Martin North, I've really enjoyed speaking to you tonight. For my subscribers, how can they learn more from you?
Okay, very easy. So I have a blog at digitalfinanceanalytics.com and a YouTube channel called Walk the World. All of my videos are up on Walk the World, and they're also available on the YouTube on the blog as well. So those are the two main, and there you can contact me via those. I'm also on Twitter as well as at DFA Analyst.
Outstanding. I'll leave a link to those outlets as your channel as well as your blog in the description below. For those of you who haven't met me, my name's Adam Stokes. You can find me at Adam Stokes on YouTube. Really appreciate the chance to speak to you, Martin. Thanks for coming on tonight.
Good to talk to you.